Okay, so good morning again. Today we're talking about Orientalism, and in particular we're going to show examples of Orientalist paintings with Ingres, Delacroix, and then two Englishmen that also were part of that group. This is the beginning of Orientalism, which is part of altogether of the Romantic period. We will, in 2 weeks, see a second part of Orientalism with later painters who are going to go on with that style. But they are from the second part of the 19th century, so I put them apart, and there are lots of works to see too. So for the sake of time, I had to split that talk. So Orientalism has been a very much of a debated subject because it often shows patronizing attitude from the part of either the writers or the painters or even the beholders, people looking at the work. It often was trying to pass a message that the Orient or North Africa culture was inferior to the Western European culture. And so this was a way to justify Western imperialism, which was rampant at that time. So let's look at the different phases of Orientalism. There are different parts depending on the region they discovered, of course. So you have the Moorish style, and this was already due to the conquest of Spain by the Moors in the 8th century. It's something that became prevalent during the Renaissance as an ornament. A Moorish style showed arabesque and other ornaments that were typical of the architecture in Spain, started spreading into Europe in the late 15th century. The Indian style came from the East India Company during the 18th century. Turquerie, which is an interest in Turkish made products and art and culture, by the way, went on between the 16th and 18th century, and in great part was spread around Europe through the Turkish embassy letters of Mrs. Montagu. We will talk a little more at length about her, but this became a very influential work, was translated in many languages. It's still in print nowadays, so it will be part of the bibliography that I showed, because it's very interesting how she was admitted within a more intimate side of the life of Turkish women. Being a woman, she was allowed in with the women, and it's interesting to hear what she has to say about that. And of course, imagine that when people were reading that, they interpreted it in an even different fashion. Chinoiserie came from the rising trade with China and East Asia in the 18th century, and we find in many chateaus that were decorated during the 18th century, they always had a Chinese room. In which not only you had beautiful lacquer work and also a lot of collections of porcelain, Chinese porcelain. Japanese came later because it had to wait for the opening of Japan borders by Commodore Perry in 1854 and then later by the British. But from that time on, the trade between Japan and the rest of the world became quite important, and suddenly people had access to Japanese porcelain, Japanese art, and Japanese prints, which became quite an important, a very influential mean for the Impressionists, for example, and post-Impressionism. And then Egyptian revival, particularly the work, very influential work of La Description de l'Égypte, the description of Egypt, that was written between, that was published between 1809 and 1822. It was a kind of a monthly work or bi-monthly work that came out with very precise description of Egypt, maps of Egypt, and this altogether summed up in 24 volumes. So we'll talk also about that later on. The political condition of the Orient. How did these contacts came about? First, between the Middle East and Europe came 4 crusades that kind of linked these 2 different cultures, or more than 2 cultures, but these cultures, let's put it. So 4 crusades between 1189 and 1204. The Silk Road, of course, the very famed Silk Road that was used between 140 BCE, so before Christ, to 1453, which is the year of the conquest by the Ottoman of Constantinople, that stopped that trade because the Europeans didn't want to go through it. And let me see if I can show you something about that. Yes, I did. And the other people too. This gives you an idea with that map that it was not only the Silk Road that was a trading road. All the roads that you see there in pink and in blue are the various trading routes that existed. This is already in 870 to show you how incredibly widespread were these trading routes. A lot of exchange, and this is discovered every single year when they do some diggings. They find, for example, in England, some coins that go back to China and so on. So that is the proof that they were very, in a sense, regular contacts between these faraway cultures. This is now in red, the Silk Road only. And then what happened when they were able to go either around Africa and so on, but how it then went through the coastlines, and you had the maritime trading route. So it was replaced by maritime road from 1453, and then gave access to particular countries like Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and Britain, which competed for these trading routes all around Africa and then going all along the coast of Asia. Of course, prior to 1453, we have the famous expedition by Marco Polo that had these contacts between 1271 and 1295. And this shows that illumination showing the arrival of Polo brothers to Bukhara. This was the messenger of Ulad. The leaflets are on the table for those of you that don't have it. You have a leaflet there on the table that you can take to follow the list of illustration, and otherwise take a seat. Yes, these. Oh no, there is one here on the front seat. Sorry, I didn't know they had. So this gives you an idea how popular it was, because it came all the way to illumination in here, the travels of Marco Polo. Then we have the Ottoman Empire, of course, and this was the reason for other kind of exchange. And the Ottoman Empire existed between 1453 and 1918. The Ottoman Empire was, of course, grew extremely quickly, and for a while, really encased the entire Middle East and North Africa and a good part of Europe too. So the final one was the opening of the Japan borders, in 1854 with the Treaty of Kanagawa, with the Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States, and of course later on with England too. The view of the Orient is quite interesting. This was often caused by the attitude of the Greeks towards the East. They were quite opposed to Turkey, which unfortunately is going to take them over too. But often the Western idea comes from the Greek. And so we see here I contrasted the view that they had from the West, and then for the East, which represent Persia. So for the West, they considered that the regime was a democracy, whereas in the East, they were ruled by tyrants. In the West, they were free citizens. In the East, people were servile and enslaved. In the West, they were committed to civic rights. In the East, there was a chiasm between ruler and ruled. In the East, people were, of course, virtuous and modest. In the East, the rulers were corrupt and immoral. And in fact, we have to look at the idea that Greece itself was influenced early in its early culture, was influenced by Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Phoenician. So we see from the Renaissance, we see a lot of representation of the Orient. This is a painting dating back to 1511, showing the reception of the ambassadors in Damascus. And so you have that representation by a Venetian painter of that world of the Orient, which is accurate, except for the deers that you see at the front. They did not exist in the Middle East at that time, and were kind of added and giving that kind of more Western image of the whole scene. And then interestingly enough, portraits of sultans. And don't forget, these were Muslim people. They normally don't accept the idea of human representation in painting or in sculpture. But their ego was such that they wanted to be remembered and they wanted to be seen. And so you have here two great names showing on the left by Gentile Bellini, the Sultan Mehmed II, painted in 1480. Mehmed II was the one who conquered Constantinople, and very young man at that time, was extremely smart in the way that he approached Constantinople. He had actually first conquered, him and his father had conquered all the countries around Constantinople, and that was the last bastion that wouldn't surrender. Finally, they made it. So here you see that representation of Mehmed the Conqueror, the Ottoman Sultan that ruled from 1444 to 1446, and then again 1451 to 1481. He was only 21 when he conquered Constantinople. It's always hard to believe when you think about it. Try to see yourself at 21 and being at the head of an army and making such an enormous step, because the taking of Constantinople by the Ottomans is going to be so important strategically in the history of the West. On the right, you have another representation that is done, of course, a posteriori, later on by Paolo Veronese, showing the same Sultan. You might wonder why these huge turban, the bigger the turban, the more important the person. Just a little later on, we have by Titian, the portrait of Suleiman the Magnificent with an even larger turban. And by Agostino Veneziano, same year, another work, this is an engraving, of Suleiman the Magnificent wearing his tiara. And this is, as you can see, a tiara that is very similar to the one of the Pope, except he added one more level. And of course, this was a way to prove that he was, even with that exceeding tier, was symbolizing his imperial power. He apparently never wore it, by the way, but it would sit next to him whenever he was receiving some ambassadors from other countries to really emphasize his power. He was an incredibly interesting person. He was not only a very good strategic man, but he was a goldsmith, and he was a poet and a musician. He was very, very highly cultured. And really interesting, he made an exception with his wife, La Sultana Roxelana, who was the wife of Suleiman, and who, by the way, has an extraordinary mausoleum in Istanbul, just next to the one of her husband. It's almost as big and is almost as beautiful as his. She was originally the daughter of a Ukrainian Orthodox priest, and she had been captured during one of the frequent raids of the Crimean Tatars, taken into slavery, and then finally brought to Constantinople and was selected for the harem of Suleiman. She was very quickly proved to be a very intelligent woman and became his absolute favorite wife, had a lot of power and did a lot of things in the country. Here she's portrayed, as you can see, by Titian as a rather alluring woman, though sensual too, but it's amazing to see her costume, her headdress that is just adorned with beautiful precious stones. And then of course that very pale skin that comes from being a Westerner if you want, compared to the Turks. And so that was quite appreciated by the Sultan. And of course, the Ottoman Empire has long been the other in the eyes of Europe. And actually, it's exactly the same for the Ottoman, who was looking at Western civilization as being something very peculiar. We'll see that in a few examples later on. They were not only arch enemies, but there was a lot of flux of ideas between the two. They're going to look at one another, and there are lots of embassies that go back and forth that are going to bring, if you look at in French and transferred to English later on, there are a lot of vocabulary that comes from Turkey, like divan. A divan in French is a sofa, and it comes from diwan, which was a particular room where the Sultan would have his councils with others, or sometimes receive embassies that were made of these reclining seats. And so the large idea of the diwan became the divan in French, so the sofa. So that is only one of the examples. And of course, during the Renaissance, the writings of humanists were important in introducing a more complex understanding of that faraway culture. The interest went on in the 17th century. We see in the Netherlands, Janlevens and Rembrandt, who were painting often together and exchanging props, use here the same costume from Janlevens to Rembrandt. So using it on a Dutch man. but again, showing their interest in that exotic culture. We talked earlier about Lady Mary Wordley Montagu. She went to Turkey in 1717 when her husband was posted as an ambassador there, and spent 2 years in Turkey. All the letters that were put together and make the little book that still, as I say, is still in print, were sent to England and explaining that contact she had, quite special contact she had with the Turkish women. And so she described Turkish fashion and the whole, and also the culture, the different habits, the way of life. And so this was printed upon her death in 1762 and literally helped shape how Europeans interpreted Turkish fashion and how to dress. You see her here in a more Western dress, but with a little turban on her head, which is that note of the contact. Even her letters were once printed, came all the way to across the Atlantic and in colonial America, where they were also published and quite interesting. In the Ottoman Empire, she visited the women in their, what they called Zenanas, which were segregated quarters. They're not called harem over there. And she learned Turkish and made friends and learned about the customs. The painter JeanBaptiste Van Muys also spent some time in Turkey. And the same painter here shows audience with the Sultan Ahmed III in 1724. And this is only one of many paintings he did. He was asked by the Sultan to represent these embassies. And he would just keep the same setting and just change the figures within. And so everybody was happy they had a record of the embassies. Here are some more painting. This is Jean-Étienne Lyotard, who is a Swiss painter who visited Istanbul and painted a lot of pastels of Turkish domestic scenes. Very interesting to see in the left painting, a Frankish woman, which means she's a woman from the Western Europe that lives in Istanbul, and her servant. And as you can see, she wears these huge patterns that were used because the streets were muddy and were very dirty. And it was a way for them not to damage their beautiful silk shoes. So they would wear this pattern. This was worn in Europe too, by the way, and very rarely shown, but it's quite interesting. You can see in the middle there that Palatine patterns represented here in England in 1773. That was a smart way of avoiding the refuse that were laying on the streets. On the right, we see a woman in Turkish dress, showing a very different fashion, big belts with ornated buckle, and then beautiful silkware that was coming often from India, with which they had direct contact. And so this became quite a fashion, and we see not only many travelers that are going to come back from Turkey and wear these Turkish costumes at home that might have been more comfortable, by the way, than the fashion of the time in England or in France. Even Madame Pompadour was known at the time to wear some Turkish dresses. And in this case, that painting by John Singleton Copley shows Margaret Campbell Gage wearing a Turkish dress. In North Africa, a lot of painters came to North Africa, and they literally founded different groups that would welcome in villas, would welcome painters coming from the north and enjoying the setting. So this is one of them, the Société des Peintres Orientalistes Français, which has become in the Villa Abdeltif in Algiers, has become a museum now dedicated to that movement. So let's look at some of the works. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, we've already seen him previously. He's that neoclassical painter, but has a style of his own. He was born in Montauban from a painter of miniatures and sculptor. His schooling was unfortunately disturbed in 1791 by the French Revolution. And then he enrolled in the Royal Academy in Toulouse, but that must have closed down because you had nothing royal existing after that time. He traveled to Paris to study with Jacques-Louis David, the great neoclassical painter. And then in 1801, won the Grand Prix de Rome, which was the famous prize that they could receive at the Academy, and that would give them a purse, literally a scholarship to Italy, typically 4 years in Italy, where they had to send works to show that they were learning something in Rome. But unfortunately, again, because of the invasion of Italy by Napoleon and so on, it was postponed all the way to 1806. But he liked it in 1834. He returned to Rome, at this time as a director of the École de France, and met there Franz Liszt. So you see, the world is not two-dimensional. It's definitely three-dimensional. Came back to Paris in 41 and died at the age of 86 of pneumonia. Just for those of you that are a little familiar with French, he had a real passion for playing the violin. And this was, of course, kind of a very well-done hobby, but it became part of the French language. And when you talk about un violon d'Ingres, it's having a hobby. So quite interesting link with Ingres. So let's look at the work. He never went neither to the Middle East nor to North Africa, but had that vision of the exoticism of that world, and often very distorted. It was just a mean for him to show nudes in a way that was not showing a goddess. And so this was a regular woman, but that poor woman was enslaved and part of a harem. And so in their mind, they were living nude all their entire life, which was absolutely not correct. And we'll talk about that. This is one of his work that I've already shown you, the Valpinçon Bather, where it was not well received, by the way, when it was painted. But some people realized Ingres had a magnificent way of handling the brushwork, and had a very soft finish when he was doing. And so the Goncourt brothers, who were great art critics, wrote that Rembrandt himself would have envied the amber color of this pale torso. The very known, the Grand Odelisk, is very known because of the distortion of the back. The back has, according to specialists, close to 4 vertebrae more than it should have in length. So it is their creation by the painter, who certainly likes that elongation of the back of the woman. What was an Odelisk? She was originally supposed to be a chambermaid or a female attendant in a Turkish seraglio, so the equivalent of the harem, particularly the court ladies in the household of an Ottoman sultan. It came to be known in Western usage to mean a harem concubine, which originally it wasn't. And this is again the kind of distortion that's going to happen in the Western world, where they are just having some exotic ideas or titillating ideas sometimes about that world that they could not have fathomed in their own Western culture, but then it was easy to project it on others. So this is a painting that's fascinating because I think the way he described the texture of the drape there on the right, the beautiful changeant taffeta that is there, and the purse, the fan with the feathers, just all the textures of the sheets is just beautiful. He was a great technician. So let's talk about the Turkish bath and harem to kind of straighten up this situation. The Turkish bath or hammam is a type of steam bath or place of public bathing that is inherited from the model of the Roman thermae. They were some that were just dedicated to men, but many of them had two sections, a section for men and a section for women. Each of them were separated in 4 rooms. You had the cloakroom where they would undress and just keep most of the time a loincloth, but would take a veil or whatever with them too. And then they would go from a warm room to a hot room and then a cooling room. What is really interesting, we'll see that a lot of scenes that pretend to be in a harem are actually showing a scene that would happen in one of these hammam, and always show women completely in the nude, which they wouldn't be. So quite interesting. Even when they would bathe, they would have often loincloths or even more. The harem that comes from Arabic harem was a sacred, inviolable place that was reserved for the female members of the family. And this would be mostly for people that were well off. Poor families couldn't afford that and often would not have more than one wife anyway. So it's typically for the aristocracy, for the Sultan or the rich merchant family. So it refers to a domestic space that are reserved for the women in the house, in a family of the house, in a Muslim family. It contained the men's wife or wives, their prepubescent male children, unmarried daughters, other unmarried female relatives, female domestic servants, and in harem of the past, concubines. So by what I could read, you can imagine how it was buzzing with children that were running everywhere. This is where the children were raised. So very large quarters in many of the houses. That was the biggest population within the house, so needed large quarters. So the harem has a different name in different culture. In Persia, it's Andaruni. In India, the Zenana. We can see how Ingres had that very erotic idea of the Orient with that Odelisk with slave. Of course, the contortion of the body of the Odelisk is already very appealing sexually for men. And then you had the slave there on the side. This is a total invention. He had never seen anything. He read different works, and this was his ideas that would be an interesting subject to talk about. The more famous Turkish bath here shows there a whole group of women with the idea that this is quite inspired by the Lady Montagu letters. Here you have that idea of these women that surround the favorite of the Sultan having a secret place where he could sit and observe, of course, what was happening. And then he would choose the person he would spend the night with, etc., etc. So this is all, if you want, the famous story of Scheherazade. And this is, by the way, also inspired by Scheherazade, the Scheherazade stories, which is a pure invention and compilation of different counts that existed in Arabia. This painting, by the way, is going to be influential on Picasso because of the fact that Ingres is very much of a linear painter where the line is more important than the color. He is, as you can see on the way the body is controlled there on the right, or the young woman dancing. These were almost abstracted paintings, simplifying very much the representation. So before we move to Delacroix, I'd like to take a little break. So if you have any question, please ask. You can have a cup of coffee if you want, or just give me some comments. Online, same thing. You can unmute yourself and ask questions before we go on. I think we've addressed a whole series of work. No question at all? No coffee, no water?
In the first slide, you had pink and blue routes. What was the difference between the pink and blue?
I really don't know what the legend was. I'm sorry, I should have known, but you see, what is interesting is how quickly the thing becomes the kind of a very definitely oriented dream. For men, it's just, and often these paintings were totally dedicated to men quarters. This would not be hanging into the living room of a house. It would be in the library of the men's library.
Well, these paintings are all done by men too, right? So
yeah.
It leads to that. Right?
But these subjects showing nudes would never be allowed to be seen by women. So very hypocritical.
Well, it seems like the ethnic composition is very skewed as well. They certainly weren't all Caucasian women in these.
Oh, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's a fantasy. It's a fantasy world. They project their own phantasm onto their painting, you know, and the Middle East and North Africa become a good subject because at that time it's becoming colonized, and so it's one way of, in a sense, oppressing their colonies, justifying it. So if you have to leave the room, do it quickly because we have to go on. You found the goodies where, there are some goodies on the table too, so enjoy. Sorry for you guys. Online, we cannot send you the goodies. No, thank you. Yes, please.
I find this art just so alive with light and
yes,
exposure to.
But you're going to see even more. Ingres is known to take advantage of the light, but what is going to be very interesting will be with Delacroix. Once he goes to Africa, he discovers that brand new light that he didn't know. He's from the north, and so for him, the idea of that light that he discovers in North Africa is going to be incredible, and it's going to change his way of looking at things. So no more questions? You're going to wait until the, yeah?
I like the way that you show a map before we discuss the geography and the art. I think that helps us.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting because we always have that idea that people were living in their quarters and didn't have that many contacts, and the contacts were huge. And so this is discovered, as I say, every year they do some excavation and so on, and they discover that typically it's with coins or some artwork, but coins travel from further away, if you want. And it's quite interesting to see how we realized how much closer the contacts were. The Vikings themselves went from Scandinavia all the way down to Constantinople through land, not only with their boats around, but they went through land. They were following the rivers in Russia and founded many cities in Russia. Yeah. One day I'm going to make a presentation on the Vikings that Per had started, but I've never had the time to come onto it. Okay, people, as nobody else is asking a question, let me mute you again. And then we'll go on with Eugène Delacroix. Eugène Delacroix, extraordinary artist, I already showed because he's really considered as the father of Romanticism. But because he spent some time in North Africa, we see that series of works that he did that are very much Orientalist works, though with him, the mentality is not so much either the phantasm of Harem or Hammam, but it's for him, he feels that he's in contact with population that would be the equivalent of the early Romans, the way the early Romans were living and even in Palestine around the time of Christ. So this was, he didn't have any negative view, if you want, of the population, what we'll see with many, and particularly with Jerome, where he falls in the same type of pitfall as Ingres. So he was born in the north of France. So imagine the light, it's cloudy, it's a very different light than what he would discover in North Africa. What is interesting, many believe that his real father was Talleyrand. And Talleyrand was a very important political figure in that time, very influential. And apparently he looked very much like Talleyrand. So that's why many people believe he was his son. And Talleyrand became his protector. He received a classical education, very good and thorough education. Began his training in the neoclassical style before he was influenced by the works of Rubens and Géricault. Rubens, the 17th century Flemish painter, that's going to have tremendous influence on his brushwork, his use of color. And when we look at Ingres, who is, as I mentioned, a linear painter, we'll find with Delacroix that he's totally a colorist. He's mainly, all his works, he's using the paint to really delineate his paintings. In 1816, he met quite an interesting young painter, Richard Parkes Bonington, who initiated him to watercolor and gouache, which he was handling beautifully, as well as he taught him English. And then he convinced him to go to England in 1825, where he discovered Shakespeare and Goethe. And he also visited the court painter Thomas Lawrence. Then came the very decisive trip in 1832. At age 34, he traveled to Spain and North Africa. In 1862, participated in the creation of the Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts. And in 1863, he died in Paris and was buried in the cemetery of the Père Lachaise, which is the place where everybody important is buried in Paris. He also illustrated works of Shakespeare, Walter Scott, and Goethe. He's a very multifaceted painter. So I showed his other works earlier. Here I'm concentrating on the Oriental works. Really interesting to look that he was already influenced by the writings of a sculptor called Auguste, who had become a watercolorist and made pastel and had made numerous trips to Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, and Morocco, and came back with lots of props from their costumes and so on, and wrote. And early on, before he ever went to North Africa, he already is influenced by these descriptions. And imagine, you talk about the light, you talk about the scents and the flavors of the cooking that is so different to French cooking, but also that idea of nude women that they had no access to, by the way. So here's a very interesting painting on a woman with a parrot. A woman with a parrot, painted in 1827. And indeed, you see the parrot on the floor and the woman surrounded by these beautiful fabrics, very exotic fabrics. There is an interesting part of the population in Morocco that he's going to come in contact with, who are the Moroccan Jews that had actually settled in Morocco already 2,500 years before his trip. At the time of the Carthaginian state. Under the dominion of the Roman and the Vandals, the Moroccan Jews had increased in number and prospered. They were always very hard workers and very creative in the way they settled. They were unfortunately discriminated against when the Roman states adopted Christianity. And of course, Christianity was very wary about the Jews. There was a pretty good coexistence after the Arab conquest. And then in the 19th century, the European economic penetration brought prosperity to Jewish merchants in northern Moroccan ports, but cost many Jews in the interior their traditional livelihood. Industrial imports from Europe drove traditional Jewish crafts out of the market. And therefore, there was a big migration to overpopulated urban Jewish quarters. There was a war with France in 1844 that resulted in ill treatments by non-Jew Moroccans. And in 1859, a war with Spain where a lot of the Jewish households were plundered. Between 1912 and 1956, coming much closer to our history, Morocco was, by the way, not a colony, but a French protectorate, which was slightly different in the sense they were independent, but held by the French. Before 1948, there were between 250,000 and 350,000 Jews in the country. That was the largest Jewish community in the Muslim world. And we'll see why this is important. First, we have to look at Delacroix not chronologically because he took a lot of notes and did a lot of sketches during his trip. He had multiple books, I think 14 books of notes and sketches that he did during his trip. And they're absolutely beautiful. We'll see some pages of them. So he never painted his big paintings in North Africa. This was done in Paris when he came back and based on the notes that he had taken and the sketches he had done. So here are some studies for the women of Algiers that we see here. The very interesting point is, of course, men had no access to harem. They had, only eunuchs could go in if they had any. But so a painter could ask all he wanted, but no Muslim man would let him into a harem. And the only place where Delacroix was able to see women was in Jewish families, where there he was welcome and was able to go and even attend some wedding. We'll see in a minute. But on his way out of Morocco, he went through Algiers, and there he met a man that was a former Catholic Algerian guy, and he accepted some money and to show him his harem, because he was not as fundamentally Muslim. And this is what we're going to see here. We see the two studies that he did for the women of Algiers, the one on the left and the one on the right, that resulted in this painting. When he, by the way, when Delacroix traveled to Spain and North Africa, he did it in the company of a diplomat as part of a diplomatic mission to Morocco, shortly after the French had conquered Algeria. For him, he wanted to escape the life of Paris in hope of seeing other cultures after doing these extensive readings. He produced over 100 paintings and drawings of scenes based on his experience in North Africa. And he was one of the ones that helped grow the interest in Orientalism. So here's the painting, and it's absolutely wonderful the way that he's already by now discovered that light that he saw in North Africa, very different. I mean, very similar to ours. That's very strong light that penetrates everything. And then the beauty of these women who are kind of sitting and discussing. They have the servant, black servant on the right, and then the very beautiful interior, typical of what you would find in Algeria at that time. And so you have that almost, you can almost smell the air when you see that, because there's surely some incense that is burning too. Now, again, you have to remember that there would have been tons of kids around too. So kids must have been kept at bay for the time he took the sketches. And of course, he didn't include them in the room, but you can be sure that there were at least 5, 6 kids that would have been running around. So most households that he had access to were Moroccan Jews. And so this is a view of the Jewish wedding that was exhibited at the Salon in 1841. And you see here the celebration after the formal wedding ceremony. This is after the wedding in sense. Dancing was, of course, a significant feature of the wedding, and still is. And you can see the musician at the center of the composition. Typically, women would be on one side of the room and men in the other. But you can imagine, for a painter who is so interested in details, it's all these costumes, these colors. Just up. Okay, so that's the cable here. I know. So this is really incredibly interesting for him. This is one of the other drawings he did for the Jewish bride that never became a painting of its own. He also was very interested in the literature and painting that he had done earlier before going to North Africa in 1824 was inspired by the Byron's poem, the Giaour, of 1813, where the Christian Jiao, who is an outcast Venetian warrior, is about to slay the Turk Hassan to avenge his mistress Lila, who had fled from the Turks' harem, and then on being recaptured was flung into the sea as a punishment for her infidelity. So this is, again, this is a little bit of the idea based on a poem by Byron. He's going to redo that painting later on, after his visit to North Africa in 1835. And this is a very different version of the painting, centered on the two horsemen, and really showing there an incredible influence of Rubens, by the way, by the handling of the horses and the energy in the painting. Also, this is very typical of some other paintings he did. This is the Fanatics of Tanger. This was recorded in his notebook that he thought, despite the fact that North Africa seemed surrounded by beauty, but there were a lot of need for improvement regarding human rights and equality before the law. So here Delacroix witnessed this event through the shutters of his upper story window, where these fanatics are called Isaoui, and after their founder Ben Issa. And at certain time of the year, they meet outside the towns, and then their enthusiasm, excited by prayers and wild cries, they enter into a real state of intoxication and spreading to the streets, performing thousands of contortions and even dangerous acts. And this is what you can see. That was recorded this is the type of notebook, sketchbook that Delacroix had, which are absolutely superb. As you can see, 14 of them where he takes note of everything he sees. He also received the commission for the entry of the Crusaders in Constantinople. This was commissioned in 1838 by Louis Philippe and completed in 1840, and shows the famous episode of the Fourth Crusade, in which the Crusaders were diverted to Constantinople, which was under siege, and then shows Baldwin of Constantinople at the head of the procession through the street of the city. Here we can see that Delacroix, again, has really captured the light that you could find in these places. Of course, when they say that where they were diverted, this is not true. We know very well by now that the Fourth Crusade had on its route Constantinople, that was known to be so rich and that they could loot easily. Other paintings of North Africa, the Sultan of Morocco and his entourage. This is again that attraction for the exoticism of the place. And then he loved horses. Again, this is very much something he had in common with Rubens. You have the lion hunt of 1861. And then the sketch for the lion hunt that he did for another one that he did in 1854. And there you can see how he really handles the painting, the color, the pigment. It's everything. It becomes almost abstract sometimes, the way he handles it. So where we see that interest in the almost more primitive side of North Africa by Delacroix, but definitely not disdain over these people that are a different culture. We see some Englishmen who are going to go there too. John Frederick Lewis, born in London in 1804, trained in the workshop of Sir Thomas Lawrence, toured Europe, sorry, not to work, in 1827, traveled to Spain and Morocco at the same time as Delacroix, by the way, and then later on traveled to Italy, Greece, Constantinople, Egypt, lived in Cairo. He married Marian Harper in Alexandria and then died in London in 1876. And for him, the interest is not at all the harem and all the titillating scene of nudes, but very much the culture. And so here we see a Frank encampment in the desert of Mount Sinai. And if you look well in the middle of the painting, you can see the famous monastery of St. Catherine of Sinai in the background. So this is really at the bottom of the peninsula. Really beautiful scene with the camels and then the big arid desert there with the beautiful tents.
And with the deer, he's sort of not.
Yeah. No, that one, it's an antelope. It's probably an antelope. So that is absolutely correct. Views of the harem or the women quarter. As you can see, women are dressed very properly, and he would use not a servant or whatever to do that. It was his own wife who became the model. And you can see a very different atmosphere than what we saw with and the prayer of faith shall save the sick. So this we have in the middle, we have an imam reading some news to women. And really beautiful handling of the light and the color. Here, the reception. So you have the beauty of these interiors, extremely ornated, but as you know, with abstract or decoration that are based on nature, but not on human nor on animal. And with a little basin in the center, the occasional black servant. And of course, that filtered light that goes through these stained glass windows. On the bank of the Nile, again, you see, you really feel a very close association with what he sees, and you have a feeling he understands the people in a very different way. And finally, another Englishman, or Scottish, I should say, sorry, for Scotland. David Roberts, born in Scotland in 1796, went from wall painter to stage designer, then did landscape painting, and then finally in 32 again, this is the same time as Delacroix, traveled to Spain and Tangiers, and then later on traveled to Egypt and the Holy Land, returned to Edinburgh in 1840, became a full member of the Royal Academy in 41, then went to Italy and died of a stroke in 1864. He is more of an architectural painter, but it's wonderful because he shows us things that unfortunately have disappeared since. This is the painting of the Hypatia of Philae. I put next to it a picture of the Hypatia that shows that he's very faithful to the monument. These Hypatia means a temple with no roof. It's directly under the sky. And this is one of the largest ancient Egyptian monuments standing today. It was constructed under the Roman Emperor Trajan and was originally built on the island of Philae and then later transported to Agilica in 1960s to save it from being enveloped by the rising water of the Nile. He also went to Petra and made these beautiful gouache. Petra, the capital city of the Nabateans in South Jordan, very, very special site that was only discovered by the Westerners in 1812 and was introduced by the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt. And these incredible carved within the rock itself, these temples, these cemeteries and other monuments are incredible. And I'm going to show you from his renderings the actual photograph of the site. So very faithful to what he was saying. Same thing here with the entrance to the Golden Temple in Baalbek, that extraordinary complex of temples and so on. This is the great court of the ancient Heliopolis temple. So this is the entrance, and here is actually the ruins as you can see them. Fortunately, have not suffered too much of bombardments and explosion that took place during the war in Lebanon. And then he just loved it so much that he liked to dress himself as an Oriental clothing. It might have been more comfortable. It became a fashion. It was, of course, very colorful, and I think you would remember him much better in this. You should see the picture of him. I should put it next to in his English clothes compared to this. In his far more remarkable when you see him in the. So this is the first part of Orientalism. I've given you a bibliography. The letters, you can still find them in print, as you can see, the Turkish embassy letters. And then the landmark book on Orientalism that dates back to 1978, but it's still very important, by Edward Said, where he comes back and explains how the Europeans are condescending towards North Africans and Middle Eastern, and that all that Orientalist art was there to justify the imperialist movement over this region by Europeans. So it's very interesting. It's very biased in other ways, but it's really a book to be read if you're interested by the subject. And then I added an article that I found that is Edward Said and Oleg Grabar with a reply by Bernard Lewis, Orientalism, an exchange. And you have the link there where you can just click on it. It's going to take you to the net, and you'll be able, it's a rather long article, but very interesting. So next time we'll look at Jean-Léon Gérôme and Orientalism. So he's what we call an academician painter, extremely prolific, an extraordinary technician. As you can see in this color, this particular painting is in Williamstown in the Clark Museum. They had to put it under a piece of glass because people wanted to touch the painting. It's so alive. The colors are extraordinary. But so that's Jérôme, and we'll see how, again, he is interpreting that. And then we'll look at the works, the Orientalist works by Ayvazovsky, who is a painter from the Ukraine, who had an enormous career, but went multiple times to Constantinople and was asked to paint and paint. And so the only painter that the Turkish people know in Constantinople is Ayvazovsky. So because there is no other. So I hope you've enjoyed this material. And if you have a question, please, you can unmute yourself in the room, please too. I'd love to hear your comments.
I have a question.
Yes.
I think you so much. I always learned in art history about Orientalism and Oriental art, but now I'm told by the next generation that that is an offensive term to use, Oriental.
Yeah, and that's following the book by Said.
Oh, okay.
So that's why I really at least read the article. But people have come back against it because not everybody, as I mentioned, Delacroix was not looking down at these people. He had a history, you know, he was looking like a historian to them. But definitely works by Aaron or whatever are very, very falling into that problem, if you want, with the fact that this was another culture that was not as advanced as ours. And when we know where the Middle Eastern, for example, were far more advanced than we were during the Middle Age. So it's quite interesting, but that's a very good comment. So the idea is you don't talk about Orientalism now because it's not politically correct. No, it is. It's part of history. But again, you have to be yourself the judge of what you're looking at. I think some look at it with respect, some don't.
Yeah.
Ron, any question?
Thank you very much. I missed, I arrived a little late, but two things. When you present the Roberts, the entrance to Petra and entrance to the Golden Temple is very much like the Sublime movement. I mean,
in a sense, he shows, yeah, he really gives it a grandeur that is appropriate to it, very much, yeah. That's part of the Romantic movement too.
Yeah.
Entrance to Petra is the most dramatic thing you can ever see, and it's beautifully done.
It's extraordinary, yeah, absolutely.
I don't think you ever get over the entrance.
That's true. So any other comments? Nothing? So I hope
I loved this. That was very interesting, Anne. Thank you. Very good.
Okay, my pleasure. And hopefully the next class will be Tuesday on Bernini. That's going to be the first part of Bernini's career in Rome. And then Thursday after, the week after, will be Jerome and Iwasowski. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful.